Amid the aftermath of the war, the air was thick with ash and silence. The sky, once a vibrant canvas of stars, was now a muted haze, dimly glowing with the remnants of alien technology crumbling into ruin. The terrain stretched endlessly, jagged and unwelcoming, broken by shattered structures of alien architecture, once majestic but now lifeless. A lone human soldier moved cautiously through the desolation, his boots crunching against the coarse, glassy terrain. Every step was deliberate, his rifle drawn, scanning for movement. The war might have been declared over, but in these forgotten outskirts, threats often lingered long after the fighting ceased. He paused, kneeling behind a fractured pillar, his visor flickering as it scanned the environment. Heat signatures were scattered, but faint, indistinguishable from the debris and burning metal. His breath was steady, but there was weariness in the rhythm. Months of conflict had dulled the sharpness of his thoughts, leaving only instinct and duty. His gaze settled on a crumbled edifice in the distance. Something about its shape felt off. The light filtering through its broken walls revealed a faint, irregular movement. He adjusted his stance, his finger resting lightly on the trigger, and advanced. As he drew closer, he could hear it, a sound, faint and trembling, like a melody caught in the wind. It wasn't mechanical or hostile, but it carried a weight that halted him in his tracks. His helmet's audio systems struggled to isolate it, but the source became clear as he stepped over the threshold of the structure. There among the ruins was a figure. She sat with her back against the wall, partially obscured by shadows, her form both alien and delicate. Her skin shimmered faintly, not unlike the bioluminescence of deep-sea creatures on Earth, and her hair, flowing like strands of liquid silver, caught the dim light in surreal patterns. Her frame was slight, almost fragile, but her posture, though weary, held a dignity that defied the destruction surrounding her. Her face, framed by markings unfamiliar to him, was turned downward, her hands clasping something close to her chest, a small, crystalline object that glowed faintly, pulsing in time with her trembling breaths. She noticed him before he could speak. Her head lifted, and her eyes, large and luminous, like twin moons, met his. There was no fear in her expression, only exhaustion and an unspoken plea. Her lips parted, and she spoke in a language that flowed like water over stones, incomprehensible yet hauntingly beautiful. He didn't move, unsure whether to lower his weapon or raise it. She spoke again, slower this time, gesturing with her free hand. Her fingers, elongated and graceful, pointed to herself, then to the soldier, then outward toward the ruins, as if weaving a story he couldn't yet understand. The soldier lowered his weapon slightly, his body still tense. "Do you understand me?" he asked, his voice muffled by the helmet's external speakers. She tilted her head, her expression shifting. It wasn't understanding, but there was recognition of his attempt. She tried again, this time mimicking his tone. The words that followed were fragmented, struggling against her alien physiology, but the effort was unmistakable. One word stood out among the incomprehensible syllables. "Home." His grip on the rifle tightened. "Home," he repeated, testing the word. She nodded emphatically, her eyes brimming with something between hope and despair. She leaned forward slightly, placing the glowing object, a kind of orb, on the ground between them. Its surface rippled with images, memories perhaps, of places and faces he couldn't recognize. But there was one image that stood out, a male figure of her species, holding her hand. The orb dimmed, and she touched her chest, her voice breaking as she spoke again. The soldier didn't need a translator to understand. Whoever he was gone. His mind raced. She was a widow, alone on a planet ravaged by war, her people scattered or dead. The desperation in her gestures, in the way she looked at him, was painfully clear. She wasn't asking for pity. She was begging for survival. He glanced around the ruin, his training kicking in despite the knot forming in his chest. The structure was compromised, its walls unstable. If there were hostiles nearby, they'd have heard her voice by now. He looked back at her, his decision warring with his instincts. Everything about her, her presence, her plea, was a risk. But leaving her here felt unconscionable. "I can't take you with me," he said firmly, though the words felt like a lie. Her face fell, the light in her eyes dimming as she slumped back against the wall. Her hands moved to retrieve the orb, cradling it like a fragile lifeline. She didn't argue, didn't cry. Her silence was heavier than any sound she could have made. The soldier hesitated, 1,000 protocols and regulations flashing through his mind. He knew the reports he'd have to file, the questions he'd have to answer if he broke protocol. But in this moment, all he could see was her, a life teetering on the edge of annihilation. He took a step closer, lowering himself to her level. "If I help you," he said slowly, "you have to trust me. Do you understand?" He gestured, trying to make his meaning clear. Her eyes widened slightly, a glimmer of hope reigniting. She nodded once, her movements careful, as if afraid to shatter the fragile understanding forming between them. He extended a hand toward her, palm open. She stared at it, then at him, before tentatively placing her hand in his. Her skin was cool to the touch, smooth like polished stone, yet warm with an underlying energy he couldn't explain. She rose to her feet with his help, her movements shaky but determined. He didn't know where this would lead or what dangers lay ahead, but in that moment, the unspoken promise between them was enough. Together, they stepped out of the ruin, the desolation stretching before them like an uncharted sea. The soldier adjusted his rifle, scanning the horizon. She stayed close, her presence a reminder that even in the ashes of war, something fragile and beautiful could still survive. The soldier's steps were steady, but his mind was tangled with doubt. Each glance at the alien woman walking beside him added to the questions swirling in his thoughts. She stayed close, her movements careful and deliberate, as though she feared any misstep would break the tenuous bond they had formed. Her gaze darted between him and their surroundings, her luminous eyes reflecting a mixture of gratitude and wariness. He couldn't shake the tension in his chest. Was she hiding something? Could she even comprehend what was at stake? They moved through the broken terrain, navigating the skeletal remains of what was once a bustling civilization. Her world had been beautiful once. Even in ruins, it bore the hallmarks of an advanced society. Structures carved with intricate patterns and technology now dormant hinted at a history far older than anything he'd ever seen. She would pause occasionally, fingers brushing against fragments of stone or shards of glass that seemed to hold meaning for her. Yet every time he stopped to watch, she'd pull away, tucking her emotions behind a veil of composure. The silence between them grew heavier with each step. He broke it first, his voice low but firm. "I need to know what's ahead. Are there others? Dangers?" He gestured to the horizon, hoping his tone conveyed the seriousness of his question. She tilted her head, her brows furrowing in concentration as she tried to understand. She didn't answer immediately, but pointed at the jagged hills in the distance, her movements deliberate. Her fragmented words came haltingly, mixing the unfamiliar syllables of her language with a few human terms she seemed to have picked up. "Danger there. Not here?" He nodded, though her answer raised more questions than it resolved. The language barrier was proving to be a frustrating wall between them, and it made every interaction a delicate balance of patience and intuition. She noticed his struggle and crouched down, tracing shapes in the dirt with her slender fingers. Her drawings were crude but purposeful, a sequence of symbols and lines that painted a map of sorts. As she pointed at one cluster of lines and mimed an explosion, it became clear she was warning him about areas still active with weaponry or unstable terrain. The soldier studied her makeshift map, impressed by her clarity despite the limitations of their communication. "Good," he murmured, committing the information to memory. She watched him with a small flicker of satisfaction in her expression, as though proving her value gave her a momentary reprieve from her grief. Their journey continued, and the rhythm of their movements slowly began to align. As the hours passed, her tentative gestures grew more confident, and she started to mimic some of his behaviors. When he crouched to scan their surroundings, she mirrored him. When he raised his hand to halt, she stilled without hesitation. The initial tension between them began to ease, replaced by a cautious understanding. When they stopped to rest, she produced the orb she had shown him earlier. This time, instead of projecting memories, she used it to display images of her world before the destruction. Towering spires that seemed to hum with energy, lush landscapes filled with bioluminescent flora, and skies that shimmered with colors beyond human comprehension. Her voice, soft and melodic, wove through the imagery as though narrating stories he couldn't fully grasp. Despite the language gap, her tone carried the weight of loss and longing. For the first time, he spoke of his own past. He told her about his home, a planet she would never see, oceans stretching to the horizon, and cities bustling with life. His words were halting, unsure if she could understand, but her eyes never left his face. She seemed to recognize the cadence of shared pain in his voice, nodding slowly as though acknowledging the universality of grief. When their brief respite ended, they moved forward with a little more ease, their partnership now defined by unspoken rules. He led when they encountered unfamiliar terrain, his experience in hostile environments guiding their path. She, in turn, offered knowledge of her planet, identifying edible plants or warning him of hidden dangers. It wasn't seamless. There were still moments of miscommunication and frustration, but each small success felt like a victory. One evening, as they camped beneath the remnants of an alien structure, she surprised him. Picking up a fragment of a broken device, she fiddled with its components until it emitted a faint hum. It was a beacon of some kind, though its range seemed limited. She handed it to him, her face solemn, and pointed to the stars. "Safe call," she said slowly, her voice strained from the effort of forming unfamiliar words. He understood the gesture. If they were separated, he could use it to find her. It was a small act, but it carried enormous significance. Their bond deepened with each shared moment, though neither fully understood its implications. She began to teach him a few basic words in her language, correcting his clumsy pronunciation with gentle patience. He reciprocated, guiding her through simple human phrases. It was a painstaking process, but the progress was undeniable. Their exchanges were no longer purely utilitarian. They carried the warmth of two beings learning to trust. One night, as the alien moons cast a pale light over their resting place, she removed the bracelet she always wore. It was intricate, a coil of woven metal and stone, clearly of great significance. She held it out to him, her expression unreadable. "Life," she said, tapping her chest, then pointing at him. "Trust." He hesitated, unsure if accepting it would carry some meaning he didn't fully grasp. But the sincerity in her gesture was impossible to ignore. Slowly, he took the bracelet, nodding once in silent acknowledgement. Her lips curved into a faint smile, the first he had seen since meeting her. It was fleeting, but it felt like a sunrise breaking through endless night. As they prepared to move on the next morning, their partnership felt more natural, the awkwardness of their early interactions giving way to a rhythm of mutual reliance. She no longer walked behind him but beside him, her steps more confident. He no longer saw her as just another survivor to protect, but as someone who could stand beside him against whatever lay ahead. Their bond was fragile, yet it was undeniable. Two strangers, worlds apart, finding solace in the shared journey through the unknown. That as the alien widow and the soldier continued their journey, the atmosphere grew heavier with an unspoken tension. The environment shifted subtly, the air sharper, the ruins giving way to a more treacherous terrain. The widow's demeanor changed, her luminous eyes scanning the surroundings with heightened awareness. She was no longer simply following him. She moved with purpose, her instincts clearly attuned to something he couldn't see. Her pace quickened, occasionally gesturing for him to stay alert. Though no words passed between them, her urgency was palpable. The soldier adjusted his grip on his weapon, his body instinctively falling into a defensive posture. His training screamed caution, but his trust in her had grown during their shared struggles. When she motioned for him to halt, he obeyed without question. She crouched low, pressing her hand to the ground, as if feeling for something unseen. Moments later, she pointed to a narrow path winding through jagged rocks and gave him a single, resolute nod. It was clear this was the way forward, though the danger was evident in her tense movements. As they navigated the precarious path, the ground beneath them began to tremble faintly. A low, guttural sound rose from the distance, sending a shiver down the soldier's spine. He scanned the horizon, his senses sharpened. Suddenly, from the shadows of the rocks, an enormous creature emerged, its massive, sinewy frame glistening in the dim light, its eyes glowing with a predatory hunger. The widow froze for a moment, her breath catching in her throat, before she reached for the soldier's arm, pulling him back. The creature snarled, its movements deliberate as it closed the distance between them. The soldier's instincts kicked in. He raised his weapon and fired a calculated shot, the blast grazing the creature's flank. It recoiled, but didn't retreat. The widow stepped forward, holding up the glowing orb she had carried since they met. It pulsed with an intense light as she muttered words in her native tongue, her voice steady despite the danger. The creature hesitated, its glowing eyes fixed on her. For a moment, time seemed to stretch as the soldier held his breath, his finger hovering over the trigger. The orb's light intensified, and the creature let out a guttural roar before retreating into the shadows. The widow's shoulders sagged in relief, though her expression remained stoic. She turned to the soldier, her gaze steady, and spoke in a low, firm tone. Though he didn't understand the words, the meaning was clear. They had to move quickly. They pressed on, the adrenaline of the encounter fueling their steps. The soldier's respect for the widow deepened. She wasn't just a survivor. She was a force of resilience and courage. Her resourcefulness and quick thinking had saved them both. He found himself wondering how many times she had faced dangers like this alone, relying solely on her wits and the strength that loss had forged in her. As night fell, they found refuge in a small cavern tucked into the base of a hill. The widow busied herself creating a faint, ethereal light using her orb, while the soldier set up a makeshift perimeter. They worked in silence, their movements synchronized, a testament to the bond that had formed between them. When they finally sat, exhaustion etched into their features. The widow broke the quiet. She reached into a pouch at her side and pulled out a small, delicately carved token. She placed it on the ground between them, gesturing for him to look. The token shimmered faintly, and an image appeared above it, a projection of her home before the devastation. It was the same lush, vibrant world he had glimpsed before, but this time, the scene was intimate. It showed her standing with her mate, their hands entwined as they shared a moment of quiet joy. Her voice trembled as she spoke, her words halting but clear. "Life gone. Home no more." The soldier's chest tightened. He had seen his share of loss, but this was different. Her grief wasn't just personal. It was the sorrow of an entire world crumbling around her. She looked at him, her luminous eyes glistening with unshed tears. "You home? Take me." Her words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. He had suspected her intent, but hearing it spoken aloud made it real. She wasn't asking for rescue or sanctuary. She was asking for something far more profound. Her culture, her identity, her very survival rested on this plea. In her world, to remain a widow was to become an outcast, a living ghost among her people. She was begging for a chance to belong again, even if it meant leaving everything she had ever known. The soldier's mind raced. He thought of the consequences, the regulations he'd be breaking, the questions he'd face. Taking her home wasn't just an act of kindness. It was a declaration that he was willing to defy everything for someone he barely understood. Yet, when he looked at her, he couldn't see an alien or a stranger. He saw someone who had fought as hard as he had, someone who had lost just as much and still found the strength to keep moving forward. He took a deep breath, his gaze steady as he met hers. "If I take you, it won't be easy," he said, his voice low but firm. "People won't understand. They'll question everything. Are you ready for that?" She nodded, her expression resolute. "Ready. Need life." Her words were simple, but their weight was undeniable. She wasn't asking for pity or charity. She was asking for a partnership, a chance to rebuild her life with him as her anchor. The soldier leaned back, running a hand through his hair as he considered the gravity of her request. He thought of his own losses, the emptiness he had carried since the war began. In her, he saw a reflection of his own struggles, a shared determination to find meaning amid the chaos. Finally, he gave a single slow nod. "All right," he said. "But this isn't just about survival. If we do this, it's for real. No turning back." Her face softened, and for the first time, a genuine smile graced her features. It was faint, fleeting, but it carried a warmth that seemed to pierce through the cold night. She extended her hand, her slender fingers trembling slightly as they hovered between them. He hesitated for a moment before clasping it firmly, sealing the unspoken promise between them. The night passed in silence, but it was no longer the silence of strangers. It was the quiet understanding of two souls bound by a shared purpose, preparing to face whatever challenges awaited them. For the first time in a long while, the soldier felt something stir within him, a glimmer of hope. The journey to the extraction point was marked by a tense quiet, both of them aware of the finality of what lay ahead. The soldier stayed vigilant, his senses on high alert, while the widow followed closely, her movements lighter, more deliberate. Every step forward felt heavier with the realization of what was being risked. The soldier's mind oscillated between doubt and resolve, the enormity of his decision weighing on him. But each time he glanced at the widow, her quiet determination strengthened his resolve. The extraction site came into view, a small clearing surrounded by the remnants of machinery from a bygone era. His communicator buzzed faintly, confirming that his team would arrive shortly. He turned to the widow, gesturing for her to stay hidden as he moved to make initial contact. She hesitated but obeyed, crouching low behind a cluster of broken pillars. Her eyes followed him, filled with a trust that made him feel both empowered and deeply responsible. As the ship descended, its thrusters kicking up clouds of ash and debris, the soldier stepped forward to greet his team. Their questions began immediately. What had taken him so long, why his report was incomplete, and whether the mission was compromised. He gave short, direct answers, his tone calm but firm, deflecting their suspicions. He explained the ruins, the danger, the challenges of navigating the terrain alone. What he didn't explain was the presence of the widow, still waiting silently in the shadows. When the time was right, he signaled her to move. She emerged cautiously, her figure luminous in the ship's landing lights. The murmurs of the team were immediate. Their initial shock was palpable, followed quickly by whispers of suspicion. He raised a hand to silence them, his tone leaving no room for argument. "She's coming with us." End of discussion. One of the officers stepped forward, his face set in a frown. "You know the protocol. Unauthorized life forms are prohibited. What's your explanation for this?" The soldier squared his shoulders, his voice steady but unyielding. "She's not a threat. She's a survivor. And she's under my protection." His words were met with resistance, their protests growing louder. But he didn't falter. The widow stood silently behind him, her gaze unwavering. She didn't understand the language, but she seemed to grasp the gravity of the situation.